What if I told you that one president died from eating cherries and milk? That another got stuck in a bathtub? That a third personally designed the nation's capital while also inventing a better plow? You've heard the famous stories: Washington's wooden teeth, Lincoln's log cabin, Kennedy's speeches. But American presidential history is filled with facts so strange, so specific, so genuinely bizarre that they never made it into your textbook. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore 99 verified facts about every U.S. president from George Washington to Joe Biden. Not the big ones you already know. The weird ones. Obscure policy decisions, constitutional precedents, and recent the oddly specific achievements that somehow shaped the nation. So hit that subscribe button, get comfortable under your blankets, and let's talk about the people who led America while doing things far stranger than you ever imagined. Starting with a man who created copyright law before most people even understood what copyright was. George Washington approved the first national copyright law in 1790. So here's something they probably didn't mention in your high school history class. George Washington, the guy who couldn't tell a lie about cherry trees, except that story itself was a lie, actually signed America's first copyright law. In 1790, he approved legislation that gave authors and inventors exclusive rights to their work for 14 years. 14 years. Which, if you think about it, is roughly 13 years and 11 months longer than most people keep their New Year's resolutions. This wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork, though. Washington understood that a new nation needed to protect its ideas, its creativity, its intellectual property. He knew that if America was going to compete with Europe, it needed to make sure people could actually profit from being smart. So there he was, powdered wig and all, essentially creating the legal foundation for everything from patent trolls to copyright strikes on YouTube. But of course, protecting ideas was just the beginning of what early presidents had to figure out. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House while it was still unfinished. John Adams had the distinct honor of being the first president to move into the White House, which sounds impressive until you realize the place wasn't even finished. Picture this. It's November 1800. You're the president of the United States, and your new house doesn't have indoor plumbing. Half the rooms are missing plaster, and there's sawdust everywhere. Adams and his wife Abigail moved in anyway, because apparently that's what you did back then. Abigail famously hung laundry in the East Room because it was the only space large enough and dry enough. The White House, that symbol of American power and prestige, was basically a very expensive construction site with a president living in it. Adams spent only 4 months there before Thomas Jefferson kicked him out via election, which meant he barely had time to figure out which rooms were safe to walk through. And speaking of Jefferson, he had his own ideas about how presidents should handle their power. Thomas Jefferson personally revised congressional rules to limit executive power. Thomas Jefferson did something almost unthinkable by modern standards. He actively worked to make his own job less powerful. While serving as vice president under Adams, Jefferson wrote a manual of parliamentary procedure that explicitly limited what the executive branch could do. He believed deeply and genuinely that presidents shouldn't act like kings. So he crafted rules, precedents, and guidelines that would keep future presidents, including himself, in check. This is the same guy who would later purchase Louisiana without explicit constitutional authority, which is ironic in a way that would make a philosophy professor weep. But the point stands. Jefferson spent actual time writing down rules to prevent executive overreach. Like someone creating a detailed budget plan they know they'll ignore during the holidays. He wanted Congress to be strong and presidents to be humble, which is a nice thought that definitely lasted forever and never became complicated. Still, intentions matter, and Jefferson's intentions were remarkably restrained for someone who also kept detailed records of everything he did. James Madison oversaw the first federal wartime censorship disputes. James Madison, the father of the Constitution and a man who weighed approximately 98 pounds soaking wet, had to deal with something the founding fathers hadn't really planned for. What happens when newspapers criticize the government during wartime? During the War of 1812, Madison faced serious questions about press freedom versus national security. Newspapers were publishing information about troop movements, criticizing military strategy, and generally making things difficult. Madison, to his credit, mostly resisted calls for censorship. He believed in the First Amendment even when it was inconvenient, even when editors were calling him incompetent, even when it would have been easier to just shut everyone up. This was radical restraint for the era. Other countries would have thrown editors in prison without thinking twice. But Madison stuck to his principles, which meant tolerating a lot of very public criticism while trying to run a war. It's the kind of commitment to constitutional values that makes you either a hero or a very patient person. And patience was something the next president would need too, though for very different reasons. James Monroe established the first formal peacetime military expansion. James Monroe did something that sounds contradictory, but actually makes perfect sense if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. He expanded the military during peacetime. After the War of 1812, Monroe looked around and thought, you know what? Maybe we should have an actual standing army so we don't get caught unprepared again. Radical concept. He formalized military expansion policies, created permanent fortifications, and basically established the idea that America should maintain military readiness, even when nobody was actively shooting at us. This was new. Previous presidents had mostly disbanded armies after wars ended because keeping soldiers around was expensive and seemed vaguely tyrannical. But Monroe realized that modern nations needed modern militaries, which meant paying people to train even when there was no immediate threat. It was pragmatic, forward-thinking, and probably saved lives in future conflicts. Of course, his successor would think big about other kinds of national infrastructure too. John Quincy Adams was the first president to submit a national infrastructure plan to Congress. John Quincy Adams had big dreams, huge dreams. Dreams that involved roads, canals, universities, and observatories scattered across America like very practical Christmas decorations. He submitted the first comprehensive national infrastructure plan to Congress, proposing a vast network of improvements that would connect the country and promote science, education, and commerce. Congress looked at this plan and essentially said, "That's nice, John Quincy. We're not doing any of that." Adams was ahead of his time in the worst possible way. Right idea, wrong century. He genuinely believed the federal government should build things that helped everyone, should invest in education and exploration, should create a foundation for national prosperity. This was visionary stuff that wouldn't actually happen for decades. Instead, Congress preferred to argue about states' rights and tariffs because apparently infrastructure was too radical. Adams must have been incredibly frustrated watching his carefully crafted plans gather dust while the nation missed opportunities for growth. But frustration was nothing compared to what the next president would unleash on the political system. Andrew Jackson was the first president to formally use the veto as a policy tool. Andrew Jackson looked at the presidential veto and thought, you know what this is? A weapon. Before Jackson, presidents had used the veto sparingly, almost apologetically, and only when they believed something was genuinely unconstitutional. Jackson used it 12 times, more than all previous presidents combined, and he didn't care about your feelings. He vetoed bills because he disagreed with them politically, because they offended his principles, because he could. This fundamentally changed the presidency. Suddenly, the veto wasn't just a constitutional safeguard. It was a tool of policymaking, a way for presidents to impose their will on Congress. Jackson's opponents were horrified. They called him King Andrew and drew political cartoons showing him in royal robes. But Jackson didn't care. He believed he represented the people directly, and If Congress passed something the people didn't want, he'd kill it. Whether you think this was democratic leadership or dangerous precedent probably depends on your general feelings about Jackson, but either way, it worked. Martin Van Buren formalized the independent treasury system. Martin Van Buren doesn't get enough credit for being deeply, almost aggressively boring in the best possible way. After the Panic of 1837 crashed the economy, Van Buren decided the federal government needed to stop storing its money in private banks that kept failing spectacularly. So he created the independent treasury system, which meant the government would hold its own funds in its own vaults. Revolutionary? Not really. Necessary? Absolutely. This was basic financial sense dressed up as policy innovation. Van Buren wanted to separate government money from the chaos of private banking to create stability and prevent political favoritism in where federal funds were deposited. It took years to get through Congress, and by the time it passed, Van Buren had already lost re-election. But the system worked, lasting until the Federal Reserve came along decades later. Sometimes the most important presidential accomplishments are the ones that sound like accounting adjustments. And sometimes presidents don't accomplish much at all because they're too busy dying. William Henry Harrison issued no executive orders during his presidency. William Henry Harrison holds a record that will almost certainly never be broken. 0 executive orders. None. Not a single one. This sounds impressive until you realize he was only president for 31 days before dying of pneumonia or typhoid, or possibly just the overwhelming realization that he delivered a 2-hour inaugural address in freezing rain without a coat. Harrison gave the longest inaugural speech in American history and had the shortest presidency, which is ironic in a way that feels almost intentional. He literally didn't have time to do anything presidential beyond moving into the White House and getting sick. No executive orders, no major decisions, no policy initiatives, just a very long speech and then a very permanent nap. His entire presidency is basically a historical asterisk, a cautionary tale about coats and brevity, but his death did create an important precedent, one that his vice president would have to navigate very carefully. John Tyler created the constitutional precedent for full vice presidential succession. When William Henry Harrison died, nobody was quite sure what was supposed to happen next. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the office, but did that make John Tyler actually president or just acting president? Tyler decided he was president. Full stop. Not acting president Tyler, not vice president performing presidential duties. Tyler. Just President Tyler. He took the oath of office, moved into the White House, and insisted everyone treat him as the legitimate president. Some people were furious. They called him his accidency and argued he was overstepping his authority. But Tyler refused to back down. He established the precedent that when a president dies, the vice president becomes president completely, with all powers and legitimacy of the office. This seems obvious now, but in 1841, it was genuinely controversial. Tyler's stubbornness created a constitutional tradition that would govern every future succession, right up to the present day. Of course, being right about succession didn't make him popular with his own party. James K. Polk directly managed war correspondence without a chief of staff. James K. Polk was a micromanager on a scale that would make modern corporate bosses weep with recognition. During the Mexican-American War, Polk didn't just set strategy, he personally managed military correspondence. No chief of staff, no delegation, just Polk reading reports, writing orders, and staying up until midnight reviewing dispatches from generals in the field. This is insane. This is a president treating a war like a personal project, involving himself in details that should have been handled by subordinates. But Polk didn't trust subordinates. He barely trusted his own cabinet. So he did everything himself, working 16-hour days, never taking vacations, slowly destroying his health, through sheer, stubborn refusal to let anyone else make decisions. It worked in the sense that America won the war and acquired a huge amount of territory. It also probably killed Polk, who died 3 months after leaving office, exhausted and worn out at age 53. Sometimes extreme dedication is admirable. Sometimes it's just exhausting to watch. Zachary Taylor refused to publicly endorse any political party while in office. Zachary Taylor was a war hero who became president almost by accident, and he responded by refusing to play normal political games. He wouldn't publicly endorse the Whig Party that had elected him. He wouldn't campaign for other Whigs. He basically acted like political parties were someone else's problem, which drove actual politicians absolutely crazy. Taylor believed the president should be above partisan politics, should represent all Americans, should make decisions based on merit rather than party loyalty. This is a beautiful sentiment that ignores how government actually functions. But Taylor didn't care. He was a general, not a politician, and he governed like someone who thought loyalty to party was less important than loyalty to country. His fellow Whigs were horrified. Here was their president, refusing to help them win elections, refusing to toe the party line, just doing whatever he thought was right. It was principled and impractical and very much in character for a man who'd spent his career following orders, not giving them to senators. Millard Fillmore expanded the Library of Congress more than any prior president. Millard Fillmore is remembered, if he's remembered at all, as aggressively forgettable. But here's something actually interesting. He loved books. Like, genuinely loved them. And he expanded the Library of Congress more than any previous president, transforming it from a modest collection into something approaching a proper national library. Fillmore believed in education, in access to knowledge, in the idea that a democracy needed informed citizens who could actually read about stuff. So he pushed for funding, for acquisitions, for making the library a resource worthy of a growing nation. This wasn't glamorous work. Nobody throws parades for library expansion. But it mattered. Fillmore created infrastructure for knowledge, established precedents for federal investment in education and culture. He did this while also dealing with slavery controversies and sectional tensions that would eventually tear the country apart, which makes his focus on books seem almost quaint. But sometimes the quiet accomplishments are the ones that last longest, even if nobody notices them at the time. Franklin Pierce authorized the first federal land surveys using standardized mapping. Franklin Pierce, a president most famous for being generally terrible, actually did one genuinely useful thing. He authorized the first systematic federal land surveys using standardized mapping techniques. This sounds bureaucratic because it absolutely is, but it's also important. Before Pierce, land surveys were inconsistent, unreliable, and frequently disputed. Pierce established standards, created consistency, made it possible to actually know where property lines were without starting small wars over boundary disputes. This was practical governance at its least exciting and most necessary. Surveyors went out with standardized equipment and methods, mapping the expanding nation with actual precision. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't solve slavery or prevent the Civil War or do anything particularly memorable, but it created order in a chaotic system, established records that would matter for decades. Sometimes presidential legacies are built on things as simple as making sure people know where their property ends and someone else's begins, even if nobody thanks you for it. James Buchanan, centralized diplomatic reporting procedures for ambassadors. James Buchanan spent his entire presidency watching the country fall apart and doing essentially nothing to stop it, which makes it almost funny that he was actually good at diplomatic procedure. Before becoming president, Buchanan served as a Secretary of State, and he brought that experience to the White House by centralizing how ambassadors reported back to Washington. He created standardized formats, regular reporting schedules, formal chains of communication that made diplomacy more organized and efficient. This is the kind of thing that matters tremendously in government and interests absolutely nobody in history class. Buchanan took the chaos of international communication and imposed order on it, creating systems that would outlast his disastrous presidency. It's weird how someone could be so competent at organizational details and so catastrophically bad at leadership. But that's Buchanan. Good at paperwork, terrible at preventing civil war. At least the next president would understand how to make hard decisions, even impossibly hard ones. Abraham Lincoln created the first federal income tax system. Abraham Lincoln needed money. Like, desperately needed money. Fighting the Civil War was expensive. Soldiers, supplies, weapons. Everything cost money the federal government didn't have. So Lincoln did something revolutionary and kind of horrifying, depending on your perspective. He created America's first income tax. In 1861, Congress passed and Lincoln signed the Revenue Act, which taxed incomes above $800 at 3%. 3%. Which sounds adorable now, but was genuinely radical then. Americans had never paid federal income tax before. The idea that the government could just take a percentage of what you earned was new and controversial and absolutely necessary for saving the Union. Lincoln understood that wars required resources, that preserving the nation meant asking citizens to contribute financially. The tax was temporary, ending after the war, but it established a precedent. It proved that income taxation was possible, constitutional, and effective. Decades later, that precedent would become permanent, and Americans would never stop complaining about it. Andrew Johnson issued more pardons than any other president. Andrew Johnson was impeached, nearly removed from office, and generally considered one of America's worst presidents. But he did issue a lot of pardons, like a truly impressive number of pardons. More than any president before him, Johnson pardoned former Confederate leaders, soldiers, and officials. He handed out pardons like party favors, restoring rights and property to people who'd literally tried to destroy the United States. This was part of his lenient Reconstruction policy, which prioritized reconciliation over justice and made radical Republicans absolutely furious. Johnson believed in quick reunification, in forgiving the South, in moving past the war without holding grudges or demanding accountability. Whether this was noble forgiveness or catastrophic weakness depends entirely on your view of Reconstruction. But the numbers are clear. Johnson pardoned thousands of people, more than any predecessor, and in doing so shaped how America would or wouldn't address the consequences of civil war. His successor, meanwhile, would focus on a very different kind of justice. Ulysses S. Grant enforced the first federal civil rights prosecutions. Ulysses S. Grant was a better president than history gives him credit for, and nowhere is this clearer than in civil rights enforcement. Grant actually used federal power to prosecute Ku Klux Klan members and other white supremacist terrorists who were murdering and terrorizing Black Americans in the South. He sent federal troops, authorized prosecutions, supported the Justice Department in going after domestic terrorists. This was unprecedented. No president had ever used federal law enforcement this aggressively to protect civil rights. Grant understood that Reconstruction meant nothing if Black Americans weren't safe, if their rights existed only on paper. So he acted, deploying resources and political capital to fight racial violence. It worked, temporarily. Klan activity decreased significantly under Grant's pressure, but it required constant effort, and once Grant left office, that effort ended. Still, he proved that federal civil rights enforcement was possible, that presidents could choose to protect vulnerable citizens even when it was politically difficult. That precedent mattered, even if it took nearly a century to fulfill. Rutherford B. Hayes introduced merit-based federal hiring exams. Rutherford B. Hayes looked at the federal government's hiring practices and saw a system running on who you knew rather than what you knew, and he thought that was stupid. So he introduced merit-based hiring exams for federal positions, which was revolutionary for an era when government jobs were basically party favors. Hayes believed competence should matter more than political connections, that the government should hire qualified people rather than just rewarding party loyalists. This made him deeply unpopular with his own party because patronage was how political machines functioned. Taking away those jobs meant taking away power. But Hayes didn't care. He'd promised civil service reform, and he meant it, even if it meant alienating the people who'd gotten him elected. The exams weren't perfect and weren't universally applied, but they established a principle. Federal employment should be earned, not granted. It was a small step toward modern professional government, taken by a president most people barely remember, which seems fitting for a reform focused on quiet competence over flashy connections. James Garfield formally opposed the spoils system in his inaugural address. James Garfield stood in front of the nation during his inaugural address and said, essentially, the spoils system is terrible and we need to end it. This was brave and possibly stupid, given that he was speaking to an audience full of politicians who'd built entire careers on the spoils system. Garfield argued that government jobs should go to qualified people, not political supporters. He wanted merit-based hiring, professional administration, an end to the corrupt practice of treating federal positions as rewards for campaign work. His audience listened politely and probably rolled their eyes, because this was how politics worked, how it had always worked. But Garfield meant it. He genuinely believed reform was necessary for good government. Tragically, he was assassinated by a disappointed office seeker just months into his presidency, which proved his point in the most horrific way possible. His death shocked the nation into actually caring about civil service reform, turning his words into action. Chester Matai. Arthur signed the Pendleton Act against party pressure. Chester. A. Arthur was the ultimate political insider turned reformer, which is like a fast food CEO suddenly advocating for kale. Arthur had literally run the New York Customs House using the spoils system, rewarding party loyalists with cushy government jobs. Then he became president and shocked everyone by supporting the Pendleton Act, which created merit-based civil service exams and effectively dismantled the patronage system he'd helped build. His own party was furious. They'd expected Arthur to protect their interests, to keep the gravy train running. Instead, he signed legislation that cut off their access to government jobs as political rewards. Arthur understood that Garfield's assassination had changed everything, that public opinion demanded reform, that the old system was unsustainable. So he abandoned his political allies and did what he thought was right, knowing it would destroy his chances of renomination. It was political suicide, executed with remarkable grace. And speaking of presidents willing to defy expectations, the next one would set records doing exactly that. Grover Cleveland vetoed more bills than all prior presidents combined. Grover Cleveland looked at his veto pen and thought, I'm going to wear this thing out. He vetoed over 500 bills during his first term alone, more than every previous president combined. 500. That's more than one veto every 3 days, which is honestly impressive from a pure productivity standpoint. Cleveland vetoed pension bills, spending bills, bills he considered unconstitutional or wasteful or just poorly written. He wrote detailed explanations for each veto, sometimes thousands of words explaining exactly why he thought Congress was wrong. This wasn't partisan obstruction. Cleveland vetoed bills from his own party, too. He believed in limited government, in fiscal restraint, in not spending taxpayer money on things he considered special interest favors. Congress hated it. Citizens generally loved it. Cleveland's veto record made him look principled and frugal, a president who actually read legislation and wasn't afraid to say no. It was exhausting and probably unnecessary in many cases, but it established Cleveland as his own man. Benjamin Harrison admitted 6 new states to the Union in one term. Benjamin Harrison presided over one of the most dramatic expansions of the Union in American history, admitting 6 new states in a single term. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming all joined between 1889 and 1890. 6 states. That's more than most presidents see in their entire time in office, and Harrison got them all done in 4 years. This wasn't just ceremonial. Each admission required legislation, negotiations over boundaries and constitutions, political maneuvering to balance free and slave state admissions, except slavery was over. So it was more about Republican versus Democratic control. Harrison supported Western expansion and statehood, believing these territories had earned the right to full representation. The rapid admissions reshaped American politics, adding 12 new senators and numerous representatives virtually overnight. It changed the electoral map, shifted power dynamics, and cemented Republican dominance in the West. Harrison's presidency was short and often overlooked, but this achievement had lasting impact on the nation's political geography. William McKinley presided over the U.S. transition to overseas territories. William McKinley guided America into something new and uncomfortable: empire. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. suddenly controlled Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and had annexed Hawaii. America went from a continental nation to a global power with overseas territories practically overnight. McKinley hadn't really planned for this. The war started over Cuba, but victories came so quickly that suddenly America had to decide what to do with all these new possessions. McKinley agonized over the Philippines especially, reportedly walking the White House floors at night, praying for guidance. Eventually, he decided America should keep them, should govern them, should become an imperial power, whether that fit American values or not. This was controversial. Anti-imperialists argued it betrayed founding principles. Supporters claimed it was America's destiny and duty. McKinley navigated these tensions while establishing administrative frameworks for governing distant territories with different cultures, languages, and expectations. He transformed America's global role in ways that still resonate today. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to regulate food safety at the federal level. Theodore Roosevelt read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, got thoroughly disgusted by descriptions of the meatpacking industry, and decided to do something about it. He pushed through the Poor Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, creating the first federal food safety regulations. Before Roosevelt, you could sell pretty much anything as food or medicine with zero oversight. Patent medicines contained cocaine and morphine without labels. Meatpacking plants were nightmare factories where safety and sanitation were optional suggestions. Roosevelt changed that. He sent inspectors to facilities, established standards, required accurate labeling, and created enforcement mechanisms. The industries fought back hard, claiming regulation would destroy business. Roosevelt didn't care. He believed government had a responsibility to protect citizens from corporate malfeasance, that capitalism needed guardrails to prevent abuse. This was radical federal intervention in private industry. And it worked. Food got safer, medicines got less deadly, and consumers gained protections they'd never had before. Of course, trust busting was just getting started. William Howard Taft filed more antitrust suits than Roosevelt. Everyone remembers Theodore Roosevelt as the great trust buster, the president who took on big corporations and broke up monopolies. But here's the thing. William Howard Taft filed more antitrust suits than Roosevelt did. Taft, the guy history remembers as getting stuck in a bathtub, which probably didn't even happen, actually prosecuted monopolies more aggressively than his famous predecessor. Taft filed 90 antitrust cases in 4 years. 90. He went after Standard Oil, American Tobacco Company, and other massive corporations with relentless legal action. Taft believed in enforcing laws consistently and thoroughly, without the dramatic flair Roosevelt brought to everything. He was methodical, careful, and devastatingly effective. Roosevelt got the credit because he had better PR and gave better speeches, but Taft did the actual work of dismantling monopolies through patient legal action. It's a reminder that effective governing isn't always flashy, that sometimes the most impactful presidents are the ones who quietly get things done while everyone pays attention to someone else. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, creating the central banking system that still controls U.S. monetary policy today. This was huge. Before the Federal Reserve, America's banking system was chaotic, prone to panics, and lacked any central coordination. Banks failed regularly, taking people's savings with them. The economy lurched between boom and bust with no stabilizing mechanism. Wilson recognized that modern industrial economies needed modern financial infrastructure, so he supported legislation creating a central bank that could regulate money supply, provide emergency lending, and stabilize the financial system. This was controversial. Many Americans distrusted central banks, remembering fights over the national bank in the 19th century. But Wilson pushed it through, establishing an institution that would shape American economic policy for over a century. The Federal Reserve has been criticized, reformed, and debated endlessly since its creation, but its existence as a stabilizing force in American finance traces directly back to Wilson's presidency and his belief in professional economic management. Warren G. Harding reduced federal spending by nearly half. Warren G. Harding is mostly remembered for scandals and dying in office, which is unfortunate because he actually accomplished something remarkable. He cut federal spending by nearly half. After World War I, the federal government had ballooned to unprecedented size. Harding came in promising a return to normalcy, which apparently meant aggressive budget cuts. His administration slashed spending from over $6 billion to under $3 billion in just a few years. Half. Gone. This wasn't just accounting tricks. Harding actually reduced the size and scope of government, eliminated wartime programs, and paid down national debt. His budget director, Charles Dawes, went through federal agencies with ruthless efficiency, cutting waste and consolidating functions. This made Harding popular with fiscal conservatives and business leaders who wanted limited government. Whether this level of cutting was wise or beneficial is debatable, but the fact remains, Harding dramatically reduced federal spending during his brief presidency, proving it was possible, even if later presidents rarely tried to replicate it. Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act. Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal himself, signed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, granting full U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. This sounds like it should have happened much earlier, and you're absolutely right. Native Americans had lived here for thousands of years, fought in American wars, and still weren't considered citizens. Some had gained citizenship through treaties or military service, but many remained non-citizens in their own ancestral lands. Coolidge supported legislation changing that, granting citizenship without requiring Native Americans to give up tribal affiliations or sovereignty. This was significant progress, though it didn't solve deeper issues of land rights, treaty violations, or systemic discrimination. Still, citizenship meant voting rights. In theory, though, many states found ways to prevent Native Americans from actually voting for decades. Coolidge rarely spoke about the issue publicly, staying true to his silent reputation, but his signature on this legislation represented an important step toward recognizing Native Americans as full participants in American democracy, even if implementation fell short of promise. Herbert Hoover expanded Federal Disaster Relief Authority. Herbert Hoover's presidency is defined by the Great Depression, which is unfortunate because he actually had relevant expertise in disaster relief. As Commerce Secretary, Hoover had coordinated responses to floods and other emergencies. As president, he expanded Federal Disaster Relief Authority, establishing precedents for government intervention during emergencies. Hoover created frameworks for federal-state cooperation during disasters, mobilized resources for relief efforts, and expanded the government's role in emergency response. This sounds contradictory given his reluctance to provide direct federal relief during the Depression, but Hoover distinguished between natural disasters and economic ones. He believed government should help during floods or earthquakes, but that economic problems required different solutions. Whether this distinction made sense is debatable, but his disaster relief policies established important precedents. Later presidents would build on Hoover's frameworks, expanding federal emergency response far beyond what Hoover envisioned. His work on disaster relief showed governmental competence that his Depression-era policies failed to demonstrate, creating a legacy more mixed than simple failure narratives suggest. Franklin D. Roosevelt served longer than any other president. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected 4 times, serving 12 years until his death in 1945. 4 terms. No president before or since has served that long, and no one ever will again, because we passed a constitutional amendment specifically to prevent it. Roosevelt kept winning because voters kept re-electing him through depression and war, believing his leadership was necessary. This unprecedented tenure allowed him to reshape American government fundamentally, creating programs and agencies that still exist today. He became the presidency to an entire generation of Americans who'd known no other president through their formative years. But his prolonged service also worried people about executive power concentration, about one person holding office too long, about presidential term limits being necessary for democratic health. After Roosevelt died, Congress proposed and states ratified the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidents to 2 terms. Roosevelt's 12-year presidency became a constitutional impossibility, ensuring no future president could build the same kind of extended power base regardless of popularity or circumstance. Harry S. Truman formally recognized Israel within minutes of its declaration. Harry S. Truman recognized Israel as a nation 11 minutes after it declared independence in 1948. 11 minutes. That's faster than most people respond to text messages. Truman had been under enormous pressure from all sides. State Department officials warned recognition would anger Arab nations and jeopardize oil access, while supporters of Jewish statehood pushed for immediate recognition. Truman listened to everyone, agonized over the decision, and then acted with remarkable speed once Israel declared independence. His recognition gave the new nation crucial legitimacy and support during its vulnerable first hours. This decision shaped Middle East policy for decades, established America as Israel's primary ally, and created complications that persist today. Truman made the call based on his understanding of Jewish suffering during the Holocaust, his belief in self-determination, and his political instincts about what was right. Whether you view this as moral leadership or strategic blunder depends on your perspective, but nobody can argue Truman hesitated once he decided. Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized the Interstate Highway System. Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, creating the interstate highway system that transformed American geography and culture. Eisenhower had seen Germany's Autobahn during World War II and recognized that modern nations needed modern transportation infrastructure. The interstate system wasn't just about convenience. It was about national defense, economic development, and connecting a vast country more efficiently. The project took decades to complete, cost billions, and fundamentally changed how Americans lived. Suburbs exploded because people could commute longer distances. Small towns along old routes withered, while cities near interstate exits flourished. The program employed millions, moved goods faster and cheaper, and made cross-country travel accessible to average Americans. It also destroyed urban neighborhoods through highway construction, increased car dependence, and created environmental problems we're still addressing. Eisenhower's interstate system was transformative infrastructure on a scale America had rarely attempted, with consequences both intended and unexpected that reshaped the nation's physical and cultural landscape for generations. John F. Kennedy created the Peace Corps by executive order. John F. Kennedy signed an executive order in 1961 creating the Peace Corps, sending American volunteers abroad to provide technical assistance and promote understanding between cultures. This was idealistic foreign policy at its most optimistic. The idea that young Americans could make the world better through service, that person-to-person connections mattered more than military might alone. Kennedy challenged Americans to ask what they could do for their country, and thousands responded by volunteering for Peace Corps service. They taught English, built infrastructure, provided health care, and lived in communities around the world. The program wasn't perfect. Volunteers sometimes struggled, projects failed, and critics questioned whether it was effective aid or cultural imperialism. But the Peace Corps endured, sending over 240,000 volunteers abroad over 6 decades. Kennedy created it quickly, with executive authority rather than waiting for lengthy legislative debates, because he believed the moment required action. His optimism about American service and global cooperation feels almost quaint now, but it inspired genuine commitment from people who believed they could help. Lyndon B. Johnson signed more civil rights legislation than any president. Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, fundamentally transforming American law and society. No president before or since has signed more significant civil rights legislation. Johnson used every political skill he'd developed during decades in Congress, cajoling, threatening, compromising, and arm twisting, to push these bills through against fierce opposition. The Civil Rights Act banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act eliminated barriers preventing Black Americans from voting. The Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination in housing sales and rentals. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were enforceable laws with real penalties that changed daily life for millions of Americans. Johnson knew passing civil rights legislation would cost Democrats the South politically, reportedly telling an aide that they'd delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come. But he pushed forward anyway, believing it was necessary despite political consequences. Richard Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency. Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, consolidating federal environmental programs into a single agency with real regulatory authority. This seems surprising given Nixon's reputation, but environmental protection had bipartisan support in the early 70s. Rivers were catching fire, smog was choking cities, and Americans were demanding action. Nixon responded by creating the EPA, signing the Clean Air Act, and supporting environmental legislation that would be considered radical today. The EPA could set pollution standards, enforce environmental laws, and hold corporations accountable for environmental damage. This was substantial federal intervention in private industry, and it worked. Air and water quality improved dramatically over subsequent decades. Species recovered from near extinction. Superfund sites got cleaned up. Nixon wasn't personally passionate about environmentalism, but he recognized political necessity and policy value when he saw it. The EPA became one of the most powerful and controversial federal agencies, defending environmental standards against industrial opposition while adapting to changing scientific understanding of environmental challenges. Gerald Ford was never elected president or vice president. Gerald Ford holds a unique distinction in American history. He's the only president who was never elected to either the presidency or vice presidency. Ford was appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace, then became president when Nixon resigned over Watergate. No electoral votes, no national campaign, just constitutional succession placing him in the White House. Ford understood the awkwardness of this situation. He hadn't been chosen by voters, but by circumstances and the 25th Amendment. This gave his presidency an asterisk, a sense of impermanence that Ford tried to overcome through competence and transparency. He made decisions knowing he lacked the traditional electoral mandate other presidents enjoyed. His most controversial decision, pardoning Nixon, was partly motivated by wanting to move the country past Watergate so governance could continue. Voters rejected Ford in 1976, making him the only appointed president to lose election in his own right. His presidency was brief and defined by circumstances beyond his control, but he stabilized government during a genuine constitutional crisis. Jimmy Carter legalized home brewing nationwide. Jimmy Carter signed legislation in 1978 that legalized home brewing of beer nationwide, ending a prohibition that had lasted since the repeal of the 18th Amendment. This sounds trivial until you realize that home brewing had been illegal federally since 1919, even after prohibition ended in 1933. For 45 years, Americans couldn't legally brew beer at home. Carter's signature changed that, allowing people to produce up to 100 gallons per adult per year for personal use. This tiny legislative change sparked the craft beer revolution. Homebrewers experimented with recipes, developed new techniques, and eventually opened microbreweries that transformed American beer culture. Carter probably didn't foresee that his signature would help create a multi-billion-dollar industry, but unintended consequences can be positive too. The home brewing legalization showed how outdated laws can stifle innovation and creativity, and how simple reforms can unleash unexpected cultural and economic development. It's a minor footnote in Carter's presidency, but one with surprisingly broad impact. Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, granting amnesty to approximately 3 million undocumented immigrants, while also increasing border security and penalizing employers who hired illegal workers. This was comprehensive immigration reform that tried to balance competing concerns, providing a path to citizenship for longtime residents while preventing future illegal immigration. Reagan supported amnesty because he believed people who'd lived in America for years, worked jobs, and built lives deserved a chance at legal status. This seems surprising given Reagan's conservative reputation, but he viewed immigration positively and believed in American opportunity for everyone. The law didn't solve immigration issues. Illegal immigration continued, employer sanctions proved difficult to enforce, and border security remained controversial. But Reagan demonstrated that comprehensive immigration reform was possible when politicians were willing to compromise. The law remains the last major bipartisan immigration legislation passed by Congress, a reminder that consensus on this issue once existed, even if it's difficult to imagine now. George H.W. Bush managed the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union. George H.W. Bush presided over one of the most significant geopolitical events in modern history, the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended not with nuclear annihilation, but with diplomatic management, careful negotiation, and restraint. Bush resisted pressure to gloat or declare victory, understanding that humiliating Russia could create dangerous instability. He worked with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, supported reforms, and helped manage the transition from Soviet empire to independent states. This required remarkable diplomatic skill. Bush had to reassure nervous European allies, support democratic movements, prevent nuclear weapons from falling into unstable hands, and maintain relationships with former Soviet republics. He succeeded largely because he prioritized stability over triumphalism practical outcomes over symbolic victories. The Soviet collapse could have been catastrophic. Civil wars, nuclear proliferation, regional conflicts. Instead, it was remarkably peaceful, thanks partly to Bush's steady diplomatic approach. History rarely gives credit for disasters prevented, but Bush's management of Soviet dissolution prevented potential catastrophes that never happened precisely because he handled it well. Bill Clinton balanced the federal budget. Bill Clinton achieved something that sounds impossible by modern standards. He balanced the federal budget. The federal government actually collected more revenue than it spent for 4 consecutive years, from 1998 through 2001. 4 years of budget surpluses after decades of deficits. This happened through a combination of economic growth, spending restraint, and tax policy that generated massive revenue. Clinton worked with a Republican Congress, compromising on spending while raising some taxes and benefiting from the dot-com boom's economic expansion. The balanced budget seems almost mythical now, a relic from an era of different politics and economics. Clinton and Congress proved it was possible to control spending and generate revenue sufficient to cover costs. Of course, the surpluses disappeared quickly after Clinton left office, consumed by tax cuts, increased spending, and economic recession. But for those 4 years, America's fiscal books balanced in ways that seem impossible to replicate today, regardless of political will or economic conditions. George W. Bush created the Department of Homeland Security. George W. Bush signed legislation creating the Department of Homeland Security in November 2002, establishing the largest government reorganization since the Department of Defense formed in 1947. 22 federal agencies merged into one massive department responsible for everything from airport security to disaster response to border protection. This was a direct response to the September 11th attacks, an attempt to coordinate fragmented security functions that had failed to prevent the tragedy. The merger was massive and messy, combining agencies with different cultures, missions, and systems into one bureaucratic structure. FEMA, the Coast Guard, Secret Service, TSA, and numerous other organizations suddenly reported to the same cabinet secretary. Critics argued the reorganization created more problems than it solved, that forcing disparate agencies together reduced efficiency rather than improving it. Supporters believed coordination was essential for preventing future attacks. Either way, Bush transformed the federal government's security apparatus in ways that permanently altered how America approaches threats, both foreign and domestic. Barack Obama normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba. Barack Obama announced in December 2014 that America would restore diplomatic relations with Cuba, ending over 50 years of isolation. 50 years. That's longer than most people live, an entire Cold War, and then some spent pretending Cuba didn't exist diplomatically. Obama believed the isolation policy had failed, that engagement offered better prospects for promoting change than continued embargo. He reopened the embassy in Havana, eased travel restrictions, and allowed increased commercial relations. This was controversial. Cuban American communities, especially in Florida, opposed normalization, arguing it rewarded an authoritarian regime. Obama countered that isolation hadn't produced democracy or human rights improvements, that trying something different after 5 decades made sense. The policy shift represented pragmatic reassessment of what works in foreign policy. Willingness to abandon failed strategies regardless of political sacred cows. Of course, later administrations would reverse some of Obama's changes, demonstrating how executive actions can be undone as easily as they're implemented when consensus doesn't exist. Donald Trump renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA. Donald Trump renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, replacing it with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in 2020. Trump had campaigned heavily against NAFTA, calling it the worst trade deal ever made, promising to either renegotiate or withdraw entirely. He followed through, pushing for changes to labor standards, automotive manufacturing rules, and dispute resolution mechanisms. The USMCA required higher wages for auto workers, strengthened labor protections, and updated provisions for digital trade that hadn't existed when NAFTA was signed in the early 1990s. Mexico and Canada negotiated hard, protecting their interests while accepting some American demands. The result was a modernized trade agreement that maintained North American economic integration while addressing legitimate concerns about labor standards and manufacturing jobs. Whether the USMCA represents significant improvement over NAFTA or just modest updates depends on your perspective and priorities. But Trump delivered on a central campaign promise, demonstrating that trade agreements could be renegotiated when political will existed. Joe Biden passed the largest climate investment in U.S. history. Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act in August 2022, allocating approximately $370 billion for climate and energy programs. This represented the largest climate investment in American history, funding everything from renewable energy development to electric vehicle incentives to carbon capture technology. Biden had campaigned on addressing climate change, and this legislation delivered substantial resources toward that goal. The law used tax credits and incentives rather than mandates, encouraging private investment in clean energy while funding research and development. It wasn't everything climate advocates wanted. No carbon tax, no fossil fuel phase-out timeline, but it was significantly more than any previous climate legislation. The investment aimed to reduce emissions, create jobs in renewable energy, and position America competitively in clean technology markets. Whether these investments will achieve their climate goals remains uncertain, but the scale of commitment marked a clear shift in federal climate policy. And speaking of federal commitments, earlier presidents had their own ways of shaping the nation's physical landscape. George Washington personally approved the location and layout of the permanent national capital. George Washington didn't just become the first president, he literally decided where the capital would be and helped plan its layout. The Residence Act of 1790 gave Washington authority to choose the location along the Potomac River, and he took that responsibility seriously. He surveyed sites, consulted engineers, and personally approved the 10-mile square that would become Washington, D.C. Washington even helped select Pierre L'Enfant to design the city, reviewing plans and making suggestions. This was hands-on presidential involvement in infrastructure planning, the first president literally drawing lines on maps to create the future seat of government. Washington understood that capital location mattered politically and symbolically, that choosing a site between North and South could help unify the nation. He selected land that included parts of Maryland and Virginia, though Virginia's portion was later returned. His decisions shaped the physical space where American government would operate for centuries. Of course, deciding where government happened was just one of many precedents Washington established. John Adams signed the first federal law governing naturalization procedures. John Adams signed the Naturalization Act of 1798, which established procedures for how immigrants could become American citizens. This wasn't the first naturalization law that came in 1790, but Adams' version changed requirements significantly, extending the residency period from 5 years to 14 years. 14 years. Adams and the Federalists were worried about immigrants voting for Democratic Republicans, so they made citizenship harder to obtain. This was transparently political, an attempt to limit political opposition by restricting who could vote. The law was deeply controversial and contributed to Federalist electoral defeats. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans repealed it once they took power, reducing the residency requirement back to 5 years. But Adams' law established an important principle. Congress could regulate naturalization, could decide who became American and under what conditions. This power has been used and abused ever since, with requirements tightening and loosening based on political priorities and prevailing attitudes toward immigration. Adams showed that citizenship policy was inherently political, which definitely hasn't changed. Thomas Jefferson ordered the first systematic cataloging of federal laws. Thomas Jefferson looked at federal laws and realized nobody actually knew what all of them were, which seemed like a problem. So he ordered the first systematic cataloging of federal legislation, creating an organized record of what laws actually existed. This sounds basic and it absolutely is, but it was also necessary. Laws were scattered across different documents, some contradicted others, and finding relevant legislation required detective work. Jefferson wanted clarity, organization, and accessibility in law. Radical concepts suggesting that people should be able to find and understand the laws governing them. His cataloging project created reference materials that lawyers and officials could actually use, establishing precedents for legal organization that continue today. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody celebrates the person who organizes filing systems, but effective government requires knowing what laws exist, and Jefferson made that possible through boring, essential administrative work. And administrative necessities would only grow more complex as the nation faced its first major military conflict. James Madison authorized the first federal war bonds. James Madison needed money to fight the War of 1812, and banks weren't exactly rushing to loan the federal government funds for a war many considered unnecessary and unwinnable. So Madison authorized federal war bonds, allowing the government to borrow directly from citizens who bought bonds as patriotic investment. This was financial innovation born from desperation. The government promised to repay bonds with interest, hoping Americans would essentially loan their government money to fight Britain. It worked, sort of. Bond sales provided crucial funding, though not as much as Madison hoped. The war bond system established precedents for government borrowing during emergencies, creating financial tools that would be used extensively during future conflicts. Madison showed that public finance could be creative, that governments could raise money beyond taxation by appealing to citizen investment in national defense. Of course, winning wars required more than just funding. It required maintaining military readiness even during peacetime. James Monroe oversaw the first peacetime reduction of the U.S. Army. James Monroe did something that sounds counterintuitive. After his earlier military expansion, he reduced the army during peacetime. After establishing permanent military structures, Monroe recognized the nation couldn't afford to maintain large, standing forces indefinitely when no immediate threats existed. So he oversaw careful reductions, shrinking the army while maintaining core capabilities and infrastructure. This balancing act, keeping military readiness without bankrupting the government, became a recurring challenge for presidents. Monroe tried to find the sweet spot between preparedness and fiscal responsibility, maintaining enough force to respond to threats without the expense of massive standing armies. His reductions were measured and strategic rather than wholesale dismantling, preserving organizational structures while reducing personnel. This showed sophistication in military policy, understanding that effective defense required more than just numbers, that quality and readiness mattered as much as quantity. And speaking of forward-thinking policy, the next president had ambitious plans for national development. John Quincy Adams was the first president to formally advocate for a national observatory. John Quincy Adams really wanted America to have a national observatory, and he wasn't shy about saying so. In his first annual message to Congress, Adams proposed creating a national observatory, calling such facilities lighthouses of the skies. He believed scientific advancement was essential for national progress. that America should compete with European nations in astronomy and scientific research. Congress ignored him completely. They had zero interest in funding what they considered an expensive, impractical vanity project. Adams kept pushing anyway, advocating for scientific investment throughout his presidency. He got nowhere. America didn't establish a national observatory until decades later, long after Adams left office, but his advocacy mattered. Adams established the principle that federal government should support scientific research, should invest in knowledge for its own sake. This was visionary thinking that wouldn't be accepted for generations, but it planted seeds for future scientific investment. And speaking of establishing new principles, the next president would fundamentally change how presidential power worked. Andrew Jackson paid off the entire national debt during his presidency. Andrew Jackson achieved something no president has managed before or since. He completely paid off the national debt. In January 1835, America owed $0. Nothing. The national debt was entirely eliminated for the first and only time in U.S. history. Jackson hated debt with passionate intensity, viewing it as a form of corruption and moral failure. He sold public lands, cut spending, and used tariff revenue to systematically pay down what the government owed. When the debt hit zero, Jackson was thrilled. He'd accomplished a goal he considered essential for national virtue. Unfortunately, being debt-free lasted about a year before economic depression, and reduced revenue created new deficits. But for that brief moment, Jackson proved it was theoretically possible to eliminate federal debt entirely, even if maintaining that status proved impossible. His achievement stands alone in American history, a testament to his stubborn determination and willingness to prioritize debt reduction above virtually everything else, regardless of economic consequences. Martin Van Buren was the first president to be born a U.S. citizen. Martin Van Buren holds a quirky distinction. He was the first president actually born as an American citizen. Every previous president was born as a British subject before the Revolution. Van Buren, born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, arrived after independence, making him the first natural-born American to become president. This seems like trivial trivia, but it marked a generational shift. Van Buren represented a new type of politician, someone who'd never known colonial rule, who grew up entirely within the American political system. He was a professional politician in ways earlier presidents weren't. Someone who'd built his career entirely through American democratic processes. Van Buren's birth as a citizen symbolized that America had matured enough to produce its own political leadership, that the revolutionary generation was giving way to people who'd only known independence. It was a subtle milestone in national development, marking the transition from revolutionary leaders to career politicians who'd never been anything other than American. William Henry Harrison never issued a single federal appointment beyond his cabinet. William Henry Harrison had the shortest presidency in American history, which meant he accomplished almost nothing beyond dying. He never issued a single federal appointment beyond his initial cabinet selections. No judges, no ambassadors, no postmasters, no customs collectors, nothing. Harrison spent his entire presidency being sick, having contracted whatever illness killed him during or shortly after his marathon inaugural address. He literally didn't have time to do presidential things. His cabinet handled day-to-day governance while Harrison weakened, and then he died, leaving his vice president to figure out what came next. Harrison's non-presidency serves as a historical asterisk, a reminder that length of service matters when evaluating presidential impact. You can't accomplish much in 31 days, especially when you spend most of that time with 19th century doctors trying treatments that probably made things worse. Harrison's legacy is almost entirely about what didn't happen, about potential unfulfilled and questions unanswered. John Tyler was expelled from his political party while serving as president. John Tyler managed something impressively difficult: getting expelled from his own political party while serving as president. Tyler was elected as a Whig, but once he became president after Harrison's death, he kept vetoing Whig legislation. The Whigs wanted a national bank. Tyler vetoed it. They tried again with modified legislation. Tyler vetoed that too. Whig leaders were furious. They'd expected Tyler to follow the party line to support their agenda loyally. Instead, Tyler followed his own principles, which were more Democratic than Whig. So, the Whigs formally expelled him from the party. His entire cabinet resigned in protest except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster, who stayed just long enough to finish treaty negotiations. Tyler became a president without a party, unable to pass legislation or build political coalitions. He served out his term in isolation, demonstrating that principled independence can mean political suicide. His stubbornness proved that party loyalty and presidential conviction don't always align. James K. Polk kept no official diary despite extensive handwritten correspondence. James K. Polk was meticulous about documenting his presidency, writing thousands of pages of correspondence and notes. But he never kept an official diary in the traditional sense, despite being one of history's most detailed record keepers. Polk wrote constantly, letters, memos, observations about meetings and decisions. His handwritten correspondence filled volumes, providing historians with extensive documentation of his thinking and actions. But he didn't maintain a daily diary, didn't write regular entries reflecting on events. This seems contradictory for someone so obsessed with documentation, but Polk apparently preferred correspondence to diary keeping. His letters and notes served similar purposes, creating records of his presidency even without formal diary entries. These documents reveal Polk's hands-on management style, his distrust of subordinates, his detailed involvement in policy. They show a president who documented everything while refusing the specific format of diary keeping. And speaking of unusual approaches to the presidency, the next president barely campaigned at all. Zachary Taylor refused to campaign for the presidency at all. Zachary Taylor didn't campaign for president at all. He didn't give speeches, didn't attend rallies, didn't make promises to voters. Taylor was a career military officer who'd never even voted before being nominated for president. The Whig Party nominated him because he was a war hero, and Taylor sort of reluctantly accepted while refusing to actually campaign. He believed military officers should stay above politics, that his record spoke for itself, that undignified scrambling for votes was beneath presidential office. This seems insane by modern standards, but it worked. Taylor won anyway, carried by his reputation and Whig Party machinery. He took office knowing almost nothing about civilian politics, having never participated in democratic processes beyond accepting nomination. Taylor's non-campaign demonstrated that military reputation could substitute for political experience, and that voters sometimes preferred authentic reluctance to ambitious office seeking. Of course, once in office, Taylor would need more than military experience to navigate complex political challenges. Millard Fillmore sent the first official U.S. trade mission to Japan. Millard Fillmore authorized Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan in 1852, sending the first official U.S. trade mission to open diplomatic and commercial relations. Japan had been isolated for over 200 years, refusing contact with Western nations. Fillmore believed opening Japan to trade would benefit American commerce and establish the U.S. as a Pacific power. Perry's mission was diplomatic but backed by military force. His ships and cannons made it clear that Japan's options were limited. The expedition succeeded, resulting in the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, which opened Japanese ports to American ships. This was early American imperialism using naval power to force trade relationships with unwilling partners. Fillmore saw it as necessary economic expansion and strategic positioning. The mission had enormous consequences for Japan, accelerating modernization and westernization that transformed Japanese society. Fillmore's decision to force Japanese opening demonstrated American ambitions beyond continental boundaries, signaling the nation's emerging role as a Pacific power. Franklin Pierce was the first president to use affirmation instead of an oath of office. Franklin Pierce chose to affirm rather than swear his presidential oath in 1853, becoming the first president to use affirmation instead of a religious oath. This seems like a minor detail, but it reflected Pierce's respect for the constitutional option, allowing affirmation for those with religious objections to oath-taking. Pierce wasn't objecting on religious grounds. He simply chose to exercise the alternative the Constitution provided. His choice established precedent that presidents could affirm rather than swear, expanding how the oath could be administered. Pierce placed his hand on a law book rather than a Bible, further emphasizing his preference for secular authority. This was unusual for the era when religious observation in public life was expected and largely unquestioned. Pierce's affirmation showed that constitutional options existed beyond traditional practices, that presidents could choose alternative forms of commitment to office. Of course, Pierce's time in office would soon be consumed by far more serious matters than oath semantics. James Buchanan received the first formal secession warnings while still in office. James Buchanan watched his presidency collapse in slow motion as Southern states began formally threatening secession even before Lincoln took office. Buchanan received direct warnings, official communications stating that Southern states would leave the Union if Lincoln became president. Then Lincoln won, and states started making good on those threats. South Carolina seceded in December 1860, while Buchanan was still president. More states followed, and Buchanan did essentially nothing to stop them. He believed secession was illegal, but also believed he lacked constitutional authority to prevent it by force. So he sat in the White House, paralyzed by constitutional interpretation and political timidity, watching the nation fracture. Buchanan's inaction allowed secession to proceed without federal resistance, letting Confederate states organize and prepare for war before Lincoln could take office. Whether Buchanan could have prevented the Civil War is debatable, but his refusal to act certainly didn't help. He left office with the Union disintegrating, handing his successor an impossible situation. Abraham Lincoln signed legislation creating the modern national banking system. Abraham Lincoln signed the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, creating the modern federal banking system that standardized currency and established national banks. Before these acts, banking was chaotic. Hundreds of different banks issued their own currencies, with varying reliability and value. This made commerce difficult and counterfeiting easy. Lincoln's legislation created nationally chartered banks that could issue uniform currency backed by federal bonds. This standardized money made interstate commerce easier and helped fund the Civil War by requiring banks to buy government bonds. The national banking system brought order to financial chaos, establishing federal authority over banking that continues today. It wasn't purely economic policy, it was also war finance, using banking reform to generate revenue for defeating the Confederacy. Lincoln demonstrated that financial infrastructure mattered for national unity, that standardized currencies served both economic and political purposes. And speaking of using presidential power for wartime purposes, Lincoln's successor would take very different approaches to Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson vetoed more Reconstruction bills than any other president. Andrew Johnson vetoed seemingly every piece of Reconstruction legislation that crossed his desk. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, and multiple Reconstruction acts designed to protect formerly enslaved people and rebuild the South. Johnson issued 29 vetoes total, with 15 of them overridden by Congress, the most overrides any president had faced. His vetoes reflected his belief that Reconstruction policies were too harsh on the South and gave too much power to freed Black Americans. Johnson opposed civil rights legislation, opposed federal protection for freedmen, and generally opposed everything congressional Republicans tried to accomplish. Congress overrode his vetoes repeatedly, passing legislation despite presidential opposition through sheer determination and supermajorities. Johnson's veto record demonstrated the limits of presidential power when Congress is sufficiently unified against you. His stubborn opposition to Reconstruction policies led directly to his impeachment, making him the first president to face removal from office. But while Johnson fought against progress, his successor would work to protect it. Ulysses S. Grant created the first national park protected by federal law. Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act in March 1872, creating the world's first national park protected by federal law. This was genuinely revolutionary, the idea that government should preserve natural wonders for public enjoyment rather than private exploitation. Grant set aside over 2 million acres of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho territory, protecting geysers, hot springs, and wildlife from development. Nobody had done this before. Natural resources were typically viewed as things to exploit, not protect. But Grant and supporters believed some places should be preserved for everyone, that national treasures belong to the nation. Yellowstone's creation established precedents for conservation that would expand dramatically under later presidents. Grant probably didn't realize he was starting a movement that would eventually protect millions of acres across America. He just thought Yellowstone was worth saving, which seems almost quaint in its simplicity. And speaking of creating precedents, the next president came to power through unprecedented circumstances. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected after the first electoral commission. Ruling Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidency through the most controversial election in American history, decided by the first electoral commission, created specifically to resolve disputed results. The election of 1876 was a mess. 3 southern states submitted competing electoral vote counts, with both Democrats and Republicans claiming victory. Congress created a 15-member commission to decide which votes were legitimate. The commission voted strictly along party lines, giving all disputed votes to Hayes, who won the presidency by a single electoral vote despite losing the popular vote. Democrats were furious, calling Hayes Rutherfraud and his fraudulency. Hayes took office under a cloud of illegitimacy that never fully lifted. The commission's decision ended Reconstruction as part of the political compromise. Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for Democratic acceptance of his presidency. This backroom deal shaped American race relations for a century. Hayes governed competently despite the tainted election, but his presidency was forever marked by how he won it. James A. Garfield issued the first formal call for civil service reform, while President James A. Garfield stood before the nation during his inaugural address and demanded civil service reform with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed merit should matter more than political connections. He called for ending the spoils system, for creating professional government employment based on qualifications rather than party loyalty. This wasn't abstract theorizing. Garfield had spent his entire political career watching patronage corrupt government, watching unqualified people get important positions because they'd helped win elections. He believed this was wrong, inefficient, and fundamentally opposed to good governance. Garfield planned to make civil service reform a central focus of his presidency. He never got the chance. Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker who'd been denied a patronage position, shot Garfield just 4 months into his presidency. Garfield lingered for months before dying from infections, probably caused more by doctors' unsanitary treatment than the gunshot itself. His death proved his point about patronage in the most tragic way possible, shocking America into actually caring about civil service reform. Chester A. Arthur dismantled the spoils system he once helped operate. Chester, A. Arthur running the New York Customs House using pure patronage politics, rewarding party loyalists with government jobs regardless of qualification, was basically his entire career before becoming vice president. Then he became president and shocked everyone by supporting the exact reforms he'd previously opposed. Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, creating merit-based examinations for federal employment and protecting government workers from political pressure. This was complete betrayal of his political allies who'd supported him precisely because they expected him to maintain patronage systems. Arthur knew signing civil service reform meant political suicide. His own party hated him for it, refused to renominate him in 1884. But Arthur had watched Garfield die from a patronage system gone wrong, had seen how spoils politics enabled violence and corruption. He chose reform over political survival, using his presidency to dismantle the very system that had made his career possible. It was redemption through policy, personal transformation expressed through legislation. Grover Cleveland was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, which creates the weird situation where he's both the 22nd and 24th president. Cleveland won in 1884, lost to Benjamin Harrison in 1888, despite winning the popular vote, then came back to beat Harrison in 1892. This makes presidential numbering confusing and Cleveland's legacy difficult to evaluate. Do you count his presidencies separately or together? Cleveland himself probably didn't care much about the numerical quirk. He focused on the same issues both times: fiscal conservatism, limited government, opposition to tariffs, and excessive spending. His comeback victory demonstrated that voters would re-elect a president they'd previously rejected if circumstances changed. Cleveland proved presidential careers didn't have to end with losing re-election, that former presidents could return to office if they remained politically viable. Of course, no president since has managed this feat, making Cleveland's achievement increasingly unique as time passes. And while Cleveland was bouncing in and out of office, his temporary successor was making his own mark. Benjamin Harrison admitted 6 new states to the Union in one term. Benjamin Harrison's single term saw more states admitted to the Union than most presidents see in 8 years. Between November 1889 and July 1890, 6 territories became states: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. 6. Harrison didn't personally lobby for each admission, but his administration supported statehood, and his signature made them official. These admissions dramatically expanded Republican political power. Most new states leaned Republican, adding 12 senators and numerous representatives who would support the party's agenda. The rapid admissions were partly political calculation, adding friendly states before political winds shifted. But they also recognized that these territories had developed sufficient population and government structures to function as states. Harrison's presidency accelerated Western expansion's political incorporation, transforming territories into equal partners in the federal system. The geographic spread of statehood marked America's transformation from coastal nation to continental power, with Harrison presiding over a crucial phase of that expansion. William McKinley presided over the U.S. transition to overseas territories. William McKinley guided America into imperialism almost reluctantly, presiding over the acquisition of overseas territories following the Spanish-American War. The war started in April 1898 over Cuba and ended 4 months later with Spain surrendering Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to American control. Hawaii was also annexed during McKinley's presidency. Suddenly, America controlled territories thousands of miles away, filled with people who spoke different languages and had different cultures. This was unprecedented. America had expanded before, but always into contiguous territory that would eventually become states. These new possessions were different: colonial territories that might never become states, raising uncomfortable questions about empire and American values. McKinley agonized over the Philippines especially, uncertain whether America should keep them or grant independence. He ultimately decided to keep them, arguing Americans had a duty to civilize and Christianize Filipinos, which sounds deeply patronizing now but reflected genuine beliefs of the era. McKinley's decisions made America an imperial power, whether Americans were comfortable with that identity or not. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to regulate food safety at the federal level. Theodore Roosevelt read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, got thoroughly disgusted by meatpacking industry descriptions, and decided federal intervention was necessary. He pushed through the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, creating America's first federal food safety regulations. Before Roosevelt, you could sell basically anything as food with zero oversight. Meatpacking plants operated in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Patent medicines contained dangerous drugs without ingredient labels. Roosevelt believed government had responsibility to protect citizens from corporate negligence and fraud. He sent inspectors to facilities, established safety standards, and required honest labeling. Industries fought back hard, claiming regulation would destroy business. Roosevelt ignored them, believing public health mattered more than corporate profits. The legislation worked. Food became safer, medicines became less deadly, and consumers gained protections they'd never had before. Roosevelt demonstrated that federal regulation could improve quality of life without destroying capitalism, establishing precedents for government oversight that expanded throughout the 20th century. William Howard Taft expanded federal authority over railroads. William Howard Taft strengthened federal railroad regulation significantly, expanding government authority over rates, routes, and business practices. The Interstate Commerce Commission gained real enforcement power during Taft's presidency, transforming from essentially advisory to genuinely regulatory. Taft believed railroads were too important to the national economy to operate without government oversight. They were natural monopolies in many regions, controlling transportation and commerce with little competition. Taft expanded federal authority to prevent rate discrimination, ensure fair access, and protect shippers from railroad abuse. This was progressive regulation that Taft pursued methodically through legal channels rather than dramatic public campaigns. He used his legal expertise — Taft had been a judge before entering politics — to strengthen regulatory frameworks that would survive court challenges. His railroad regulation was less flashy than Roosevelt's trust-busting, but potentially more enduring, creating administrative systems that governed railroad behavior for decades. Taft showed that effective regulation required careful legal construction, not just political will. And speaking of changing how presidents operated, the next administration would transform presidential communication entirely. Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress in person, reversing a century-old custom. Woodrow Wilson broke a tradition that had lasted over 100 years when he addressed Congress in person in April 1913. Every president since John Adams had submitted written messages to Congress rather than appearing before them personally. Jefferson had started this custom, considering personal addresses too monarchical, too reminiscent of British kings addressing Parliament. Wilson thought this was silly. He believed presidents should speak directly to Congress, should engage personally in legislative persuasion. So he just showed up and gave a speech about tariff reform. Congress was surprised but receptive. Wilson's personal address reestablished presidential speeches to Congress as normal practice, creating the tradition that continues today with State of the Union addresses. This seems like a small procedural change, but it fundamentally altered how presidents communicated with Congress and the public. Wilson could use oratory skills directly, could make personal appeals, could command attention in ways written messages never achieved. His willingness to break century-old customs showed presidents could reshape institutional practices when those practices no longer served useful purposes. Warren G. Harding commuted more prison sentences than any president before him. Warren G. Harding commuted prison sentences for over 800 federal prisoners, more than any president before him. He freed political prisoners jailed under the Espionage Act during World War I, including socialist leader Eugene Debs, who'd been imprisoned for speaking against the war. Harding believed the wartime prosecutions had gone too far, that people imprisoned for speech shouldn't remain in jail after the emergency ended. He invited Debs to the White House after commuting his sentence, which was remarkable considering Debs had run for president from prison and was considered a radical threat by many Americans. Harding's commutations reflected his generally lenient approach to criminal justice and his belief that post-war reconciliation required forgiveness. Critics argued he was soft on criminals and radicals. Harding thought justice required mercy, especially for people imprisoned under war measures that seemed excessive in peacetime. His record on commutations showed surprising compassion from a president often remembered primarily for corruption scandals. And speaking of unexpected presidential actions, the next president's oath ceremony was unusually informal. Calvin Coolidge was sworn in by his father, a local notary. Public Calvin Coolidge became president in the middle of the night in a Vermont farmhouse, with his father administering the oath of office by kerosene lamp. Warren Harding had died suddenly, and Coolidge was vacationing at his family home with no electricity or telephone. A messenger arrived after midnight with news of Harding's death. Coolidge's father, a notary public and justice of the peace, administered the presidential oath in the family parlor at 2:47 a.m. on August 3, 1923. This was the only time a father swore in his son as president, and the only presidential oath taken by lamplight in a private home. Later, there were questions about whether a state notary could administer federal oaths, so Coolidge took the oath again in Washington to be safe. But the image of a plain-spoken Vermont farmer swearing in his son as president in a humble farmhouse became part of Coolidge mythology, reinforcing his image as a simple, honest man untouched by Washington corruption. Herbert Hoover reorganized federal emergency response systems. Herbert Hoover brought expertise in disaster coordination to the presidency, having organized massive relief efforts during World War I and various natural disasters as Commerce Secretary. As president, he reorganized federal emergency response systems, creating more efficient coordination between federal, state, and local governments during crises. Hoover established protocols for rapid federal assistance during floods, earthquakes, and other disasters. He believed government should facilitate emergency response without taking over local authority entirely, which reflected his general philosophy of cooperative federalism. These systems actually worked well for natural disasters. When the Mississippi River flooded in 1927, Hoover's coordination efforts were widely praised. His disaster response reorganization created frameworks that later presidents would build upon, expanding federal emergency management far beyond what Hoover envisioned. Unfortunately for Hoover, economic disasters proved different from natural ones, and his careful systems for coordinating disaster relief didn't translate to addressing the Great Depression. But his organizational innovations in emergency management remained valuable regardless of his broader presidential failures. Franklin D. Roosevelt created more federal agencies than any other president. Franklin D. Roosevelt created federal agencies like he was collecting them. The alphabet soup of New Deal programs, CCC, WPA, TVA, SEC, NLRB, FDIC, SSA, and dozens more, fundamentally transformed American government. Roosevelt believed the Depression required aggressive federal intervention, that traditional limited government couldn't address economic collapse on this scale. So he created agencies to provide jobs, regulate industries, protect consumers, support farmers, build infrastructure, and generally do everything government hadn't done before. Some agencies were temporary, others became permanent fixtures. The Social Security Administration, Securities and Exchange Commission, and Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation still exist today, nearly a century later. Roosevelt's agency creation expanded federal government's scope and power more than any president before or since. Critics argued he was creating socialism, destroying American capitalism, accumulating dangerous presidential power. Roosevelt argued he was saving capitalism from itself, that regulation and support prevented complete economic collapse. Either way, his administrative legacy reshaped American government permanently, establishing the modern administrative state that conservatives still criticize and progressives still defend. Harry S. Truman ordered the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, ordering desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. This was genuinely radical for the era. The military had been segregated since its founding, with black soldiers serving in separate units under white officers. Truman ordered integration, declaring that there should be equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces without regard to race. Military leaders resisted, arguing integration would harm morale and combat effectiveness. Truman didn't care. He believed segregation was wrong and that America couldn't claim to lead the free world while treating black soldiers as inferior. Integration happened gradually over several years, but Truman's order established the principle and forced the process forward. The military became one of the first major American institutions to desegregate, demonstrating that integration was possible and effective. Truman's decision took political courage. Southern Democrats were furious, and his civil rights stance contributed to the Dixiecrat revolt in the 1948 election. But Truman believed it was right, so he did it. Dwight D. Eisenhower enforced school desegregation. Using federal troops, Dwight D. Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas in September 1957 to enforce school desegregation, demonstrating that the federal government would protect civil rights even against state resistance. Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus had used National Guard troops to prevent 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School, defying federal court orders to desegregate. Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and deployed the 101st Airborne Division to protect the students and enforce integration. This was unprecedented use of federal military force to protect civil rights. Eisenhower wasn't personally passionate about desegregation. He'd have preferred gradual, voluntary integration, but he believed federal law must be enforced, that states couldn't simply ignore Supreme Court rulings. The troops escorted the Little Rock Nine into school, protecting them from hostile crowds and ensuring desegregation proceeded. Eisenhower's action established that federal government would use force if necessary to protect constitutional rights, setting precedents for future civil rights enforcement. John F. Kennedy expanded federal arts and culture funding. John F. Kennedy believed government should support arts and culture, that a civilized nation invested in creativity and expression beyond purely commercial considerations. He expanded federal arts funding significantly, supporting initiatives that would later lead to the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. Kennedy invited artists, writers, and musicians to the White House, treating cultural figures as important as politicians or business leaders. He believed America's cultural vitality mattered for international prestige, that demonstrating artistic excellence was part of competing with the Soviet Union. The Kennedys transformed the White House into a cultural center, hosting performances and exhibitions that celebrated American creativity. This wasn't just personal taste. Kennedy genuinely believed federal government should support culture. His advocacy laid groundwork for permanent federal arts funding that continues today, though always controversially. Kennedy showed that presidents could use their platform to elevate arts and culture to argue that government investment in creativity served national interest beyond immediate economic return. Lyndon B. Johnson created Medicare and Medicaid in a single legislative push. Lyndon B. Johnson signed Medicare and Medicaid into law in July 1965, creating government health insurance for elderly and poor Americans. This was transformative social legislation that Democrats had pursued for decades. Johnson used his legislative skills and post-assassination political capital to push through programs that would provide health care to millions of Americans who couldn't afford private insurance. Medicare covered Americans over 65, while Medicaid covered low-income families. Both programs started modestly, but grew enormously over subsequent decades. Johnson understood he was creating entitlements that would be politically impossible to repeal once people began receiving benefits. He was right. Medicare and Medicaid became permanent features of American social policy, expanding rather than contracting over time. The programs faced criticism about costs and efficiency, but they fundamentally changed healthcare access for vulnerable populations. Johnson's Great Society legislation transformed the social safety net, establishing government responsibility for healthcare that continues today, though debates about scope and funding never ended. Richard Nixon established formal relations with the People's Republic of China. Richard Nixon flew to China in February 1972, becoming the first American president to visit the People's Republic of China and establishing diplomatic relations that transformed global politics. This was shocking. Nixon had built his political career on anti-communism, had been a fierce critic of communist China for decades. Then he decided that strategic realities mattered more than ideological consistency, that America needed relationships with China to balance Soviet power and address global challenges. Nixon's visit was carefully choreographed diplomacy, full of symbolic gestures and substantive negotiations. He met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, discussing trade, Taiwan, and regional security. The visit didn't immediately normalize relations. That took years, but it ended decades of mutual isolation. Nixon could open China because his anti-communist credentials protected him from conservative criticism. A liberal Democrat attempting the same thing would have faced accusations of being soft on communism. Nixon demonstrated that foreign policy required pragmatism over ideology, that presidents could reverse positions when circumstances changed. Gerald Ford issued the only unconditional presidential pardon. Gerald Ford issued the most controversial pardon in American history when he unconditionally pardoned Richard Nixon in September 1974, just 1 month after becoming president. This wasn't a pardon for specific crimes. It was a blanket pardon for any crimes Nixon might have committed while president. Ford believed the nation needed to move past Watergate, that prolonged investigations and potential criminal trials would paralyze government and prevent healing. The reaction was immediate and furious. Ford's approval ratings dropped 20 points overnight. Critics accused him of a corrupt bargain, claiming he'd promised Nixon a pardon in exchange for the presidency. Ford insisted he acted solely to end the national nightmare, to let America focus on future challenges rather than past scandals. History has been kinder to Ford's decision than contemporary opinion was. Many historians now believe the pardon, while politically costly, did help the nation move forward. But it destroyed Ford's political future and defined his brief presidency more than any other single action. Jimmy Carter transferred control of the Panama Canal back to Panama. Jimmy Carter signed treaties in 1977, returning the Panama Canal to Panama, ending American control over the waterway that had existed since 1904. This was deeply controversial. Conservatives argued America built the canal, defended it, and had every right to keep it. The slogan, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we're going to keep it," resonated with many Americans who saw the canal as American property. Carter believed continued control was colonial anachronism, that Panama deserved sovereignty over its own territory. The treaties gradually transferred control, with Panama assuming full authority in 1999. Carter spent enormous political capital getting Senate ratification, personally lobbying skeptical senators, and defending the decision publicly. The canal transfer probably cost Carter crucial conservative support and contributed to his re-election defeat. But Carter believed it was right, that America should respect Panamanian sovereignty even when politically difficult. The transfer proceeded smoothly, demonstrating that American interests could be protected through cooperation rather than control. Ronald Reagan negotiated the first treaty eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in December 1987, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons for the first time in history. This was remarkable for someone who'd spent years calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and building up American military forces. Reagan combined military strength with diplomatic engagement, believing America could negotiate from strength. The treaty eliminated all ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 310 and 3,400 miles. Both sides destroyed nearly 2,600 missiles under strict verification procedures. Reagan's trust but verify approach established inspection protocols that made arms control verifiable rather than just promised. The treaty demonstrated that nuclear arsenals could actually decrease rather than just growing slower. Reagan showed that anti-communist hardliners could negotiate arms control when they believed verification was adequate. His willingness to engage Gorbachev produced tangible results that made the world marginally safer while maintaining American security. George H.W. Bush oversaw the reunification of Germany through diplomacy. George H.W. Bush managed one of the most delicate diplomatic challenges in modern history: German reunification following the Berlin Wall's fall in November 1989. This required balancing competing interests of Germany, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and other nations nervous about unified German power. Bush supported reunification while addressing legitimate concerns about European stability. He worked with Soviet leader Gorbachev to ensure reunification happened peacefully, with unified Germany remaining in NATO despite Soviet objections. Bush navigated complex negotiations involving treaties, security guarantees, and economic assistance that made reunification acceptable to all parties. The process could have gone badly. Reunification imposed hastily or opposed too strongly could have destabilized Europe or sparked conflict. Instead, it happened remarkably smoothly, with unified Germany emerging as a democratic, peaceful member of Western institutions. Bush's diplomatic management ensured that Cold War's end in Europe was orderly rather than chaotic. His restraint and careful coalition building produced outcomes that avoided worst-case scenarios and created surprisingly stable new arrangements. Bill Clinton signed the law creating the AmeriCorps program. Bill Clinton signed legislation creating AmeriCorps in September 1993, establishing a national service program that allowed Americans to serve their communities while earning education benefits. Clinton believed in national service, in the idea that young Americans should have opportunities to serve domestically, just as Peace Corps volunteers served abroad. AmeriCorps placed thousands of volunteers in nonprofit organizations, schools, and public agencies, addressing community needs from tutoring to disaster relief to environmental conservation. Participants earned modest living allowances plus education awards they could use for college or student loans. The program faced criticism from conservatives who viewed it as expensive government overreach and from liberals who thought it didn't do enough. Clinton believed service programs strengthened communities and civic engagement, that government should facilitate opportunities for Americans to contribute meaningfully. AmeriCorps survived political opposition to become a permanent program, with hundreds of thousands of Americans serving since its creation. Clinton demonstrated that national service programs could work at scale, creating infrastructure for civic engagement beyond purely military service. George W. Bush authorized the largest expansion of education testing standards. George W. Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act in January 2002, dramatically expanding federal education, testing requirements, and accountability standards. This was bipartisan legislation that Bush championed, believing standardized testing would expose achievement gaps and force schools to improve performance for all students. The law required annual testing in reading and math for students in grades 3 through 8, with results broken down by race, income, and other demographics. Schools that failed to show adequate progress faced consequences ranging from required improvements to potential restructuring. Bush believed measurement was essential for accountability, that you couldn't improve education without knowing which students and schools were failing. Critics argued excessive testing narrowed curriculum, that teaching to test reduced genuine learning. The law became increasingly controversial, with states and educators pushing back against federal mandates. Later revisions reduced federal control while maintaining some testing requirements. Bush's education reform demonstrated federal government's expanding role in traditionally local education policy, for better or worse depending on your perspective. Barack Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Act restructuring financial regulation. Barack Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in July 2010, creating the most comprehensive financial regulation since the Great Depression. This was direct response to the 2008 financial crisis, attempting to prevent future collapses through increased oversight and consumer protection. The law created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, established new capital requirements for banks, regulated derivatives trading, and implemented the Volcker Rule limiting proprietary trading by banks. Dodd-Frank was massive legislation running over 2,000 pages, touching virtually every aspect of financial services. Financial industry fought it aggressively, arguing excessive regulation would harm economic growth and competitiveness. Obama believed regulation was necessary to prevent the kind of reckless behavior that had crashed the economy. Implementation proved complex and controversial, with rules taking years to finalize and industries lobbying for exemptions. Later administrations weakened some provisions, but core regulatory structures remained. Obama's financial reform demonstrated that major crises create opportunities for structural change, even if resulting regulations face constant pressure to weaken over time. Donald Trump oversaw the largest single-year federal judicial appointment total. Donald Trump appointed and the Senate confirmed more federal judges in his first year than any president in history, fundamentally reshaping the federal judiciary. Trump appointed 12 appeals court judges in 2017 alone, along with numerous district court judges. Over his full term, he appointed over 200 federal judges, including 3 Supreme Court justices. This wasn't just about quantity. Trump's appointments were notably young and conservative, selected to influence judicial decisions for decades. The rapid appointments were possible because Senate Republicans had blocked many of Obama's nominees, leaving vacancies ready to fill. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell prioritized judicial confirmations above virtually all other business, sometimes confirming judges with limited experience or controversial records. Trump's judicial legacy will outlast his presidency by decades, shaping legal interpretations long after he left office. Whether you view this as restoring constitutional interpretation or packing courts with ideologues depends entirely on your judicial philosophy. But the numbers are undeniable. Trump reshaped the federal judiciary faster than any modern president. Joe Biden signed legislation allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act in August 2022, which included provisions allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. This was something Democrats had pursued for decades, arguing that government health programs should use their purchasing power to reduce costs. Previously, Medicare was prohibited from negotiating prices, instead paying whatever pharmaceutical companies charged. The new law allowed negotiation for a limited number of drugs, with the list expanding over time. It also capped out-of-pocket prescription costs for Medicare beneficiaries and limited insulin prices. Pharmaceutical industry fought these provisions aggressively, arguing price controls would reduce innovation and drug development. Biden believed Medicare beneficiaries deserved relief from escalating drug costs. That negotiation was common sense rather than radical intervention. The actual impact of negotiations will take years to assess, as implementation is gradual. But the principle was established. Medicare could negotiate prices rather than accepting whatever companies demanded. Biden achieved a policy goal that had eluded previous administrations despite decades of advocacy. George Washington established the first presidential cabinet structure. George Washington created the presidential cabinet almost by necessity, realizing one person couldn't run the entire executive branch alone. The Constitution mentioned executive departments without specifying their structure or function, leaving Washington to figure out what his administration should look like. He created 4 cabinet positions: Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and Attorney General. Washington chose strong personalities for these roles: Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. Then actually listened to their advice, creating a deliberative body that shaped policy through discussion and debate. This cabinet structure became standard for future presidents, though specific departments changed over time. Washington established the precedent that presidents should seek counsel from department heads, should build administrations of capable advisors rather than ruling alone. His cabinet meetings were sometimes contentious, especially between Hamilton and Jefferson, but Washington valued diverse perspectives. He showed that strong leadership meant assembling talented teams and actually considering their advice. And speaking of using executive power wisely, later presidents would handle sensitive communications in their own distinctive ways. Thomas Jefferson conducted the first classified executive correspondence. Thomas Jefferson understood that some presidential communications needed to remain confidential, that not every diplomatic exchange or strategic discussion should be public knowledge. He conducted the first classified executive correspondence, establishing precedents for presidential secrecy that continue today. Jefferson created systems for protecting sensitive information, ensuring that military plans, diplomatic negotiations, and intelligence remained confidential when necessary. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical governance. Presidents need to communicate candidly with advisors and foreign leaders without every word becoming public immediately. Jefferson balanced this necessary confidentiality with democratic accountability, providing Congress with information needed for oversight while protecting genuinely sensitive material. His approach to classified correspondence established frameworks that expanded dramatically over subsequent centuries. Modern presidential classification systems are vastly more complex than anything Jefferson envisioned. But the basic principle that some executive communications must remain confidential for government to function effectively traces back to his administration. Of course, confidential communications became especially crucial during wartime. James Madison oversaw the first federal war conducted under the Constitution. James Madison became the first president to conduct a congressionally declared war under the Constitution when he led America into the War of 1812 against Britain. This was different from previous military actions. Congress formally declared war, appropriated funds, and exercised constitutional authority over military conflict. Madison navigated the constitutional framework for war powers, establishing precedents about how presidents and Congress would share authority during wartime. The war tested whether American democracy could wage war effectively, whether congressional oversight would hamper military operations, whether Republican government could compete with monarchical efficiency. Results were mixed. America didn't lose, which counted as victory given how unprepared the nation was. Madison demonstrated that democratic war-making was possible, if messy. His presidency established patterns for wartime governance, congressional executive relations during conflict, and constitutional limits on presidential war powers. Later presidents would push those limits aggressively, but Madison set initial precedents during America's first constitutional war. And speaking of presidential power during crises, later presidents would test constitutional boundaries even further. Abraham Lincoln used executive authority to suspend habeas corpus. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, allowing military detention of suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial. This was constitutionally controversial. The Constitution allows habeas corpus suspension during rebellion or invasion, but doesn't specify whether Congress or the president holds that authority. Lincoln decided he could do it as commander-in-chief during rebellion, and did so unilaterally before Congress convened. Thousands of people were detained, some clearly dangerous, others possibly just vocal critics. Lincoln believed national survival required these measures, that constitutional niceties mattered less than preserving the Union those constitutional protections served. Critics accused him of tyranny, of destroying the very freedoms he claimed to defend. Lincoln argued that the Constitution wasn't a suicide pact, that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures. Congress eventually authorized habeas corpus suspension, retrospectively legitimizing Lincoln's actions. Whether Lincoln was a visionary leader who saved democracy or an authoritarian who violated civil liberties depends partly on whether you believe outcomes justify means. His suspension of habeas corpus remains one of the most controversial exercises of presidential power in American history. Ulysses S. Grant was the first president to visit the Deep South after the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant traveled extensively through the Deep South during his presidency, becoming the first president to visit these states after the Civil War. This wasn't ceremonial tourism. Grant went to assess Reconstruction progress, to demonstrate federal commitment to protecting freed Black Americans, and to show that the South remained part of the Union. His visits were politically significant, showing presidential engagement with the hardest problems of reunification. Grant met with Black political leaders, witnessed racial violence firsthand, and saw how inadequately Reconstruction was protecting civil rights. These visits informed his aggressive use of federal force against the Ku Klux Klan and his support for civil rights legislation. Grant understood that presidential presence mattered, that showing up communicated priorities more clearly than written statements. His Southern visits were sometimes tense. Not everyone welcomed a president committed to racial equality and federal intervention. But Grant went anyway, believing direct observation was necessary for effective governance. His willingness to engage directly with Reconstruction's challenges demonstrated commitment that later presidents largely abandoned. Theodore Roosevelt formalized the concept of the bully pulpit. Theodore Roosevelt understood presidential power differently than his predecessors, recognizing that the presidency's greatest strength was its ability to command public attention. He called this the bully pulpit, using bully in its old sense meaning wonderful or excellent. Roosevelt believed presidents should use their platform to shape public opinion, to advocate for policies, to lead through persuasion as much as through formal authority. He gave speeches constantly, spoke to reporters regularly, and used media to advance his agenda. This was new. Previous presidents had generally kept lower public profiles, communicating primarily through formal messages rather than constant public engagement. Roosevelt made the presidency a permanent campaign for public support, believing that mobilized public opinion could pressure Congress and overcome institutional resistance. His use of the bully pulpit transformed presidential power, establishing the president as national spokesperson and primary political communicator. Later presidents built on Roosevelt's innovation, using increasingly sophisticated media to reach ever larger audiences. Roosevelt showed that presidential influence extended far beyond constitutional authority when exercised through effective public communication. Franklin D. Roosevelt redefined the modern press conference. Franklin D. Roosevelt transformed presidential press conferences from rare formal affairs into regular, intimate sessions that shaped how presidents communicated. Roosevelt held over 900 press conferences during his presidency, meeting reporters frequently and speaking with them directly rather than through written statements. He understood that managing press relations was crucial for maintaining public support, that reporters could be allies if treated respectfully and given access. Roosevelt's press conferences were remarkably casual by modern standards. Reporters crowded into his office, asked questions freely, and engaged in back and forth exchanges. There were rules. Some things were off the record. Direct quotation wasn't allowed without permission, but within those boundaries, Roosevelt was accessible and engaging. He used press conferences to float trial balloons, explain policies, and shape news coverage. This regular communication gave reporters content while giving Roosevelt control over his message. Later presidents formalized press conferences with podiums and official transcripts, but Roosevelt established the practice of regular presidential engagement with journalists that continues today. Ronald Reagan restored the use of national addresses for policy persuasion. Ronald Reagan revitalized presidential addresses to the nation, using television speeches to build public support for his policies and pressure Congress to act. This wasn't new. Presidents had given national addresses before, but Reagan did it more effectively than anyone since Franklin Roosevelt's radio fireside chats. Reagan was called the great communicator because he understood how to use television to connect with viewers personally, to make complex policies feel simple and necessary. He gave addresses on tax cuts, defense spending, and foreign policy that moved public opinion and created political momentum for his agenda. Reagan's success came from genuine communication skill developed through years as actor and spokesman. He knew how to deliver lines, how to use cameras effectively, how to seem both authoritative and approachable. His addresses made viewers feel like he was speaking directly to them, explaining why his policies mattered for their lives. This ability to communicate through television gave Reagan power beyond his formal authority, allowing him to shape debates and pressure opposition through public appeals. Joe Biden presided over the first post-pandemic national economic recovery legislation. Joe Biden signed the American Rescue Plan in March 2021, providing $1.9 trillion in pandemic relief and economic recovery funding. This was the first major legislative response to post-pandemic economic challenges, addressing unemployment, business closures, and healthcare strains from COVID-19. The law provided direct payments to most Americans, extended unemployment benefits, funded vaccine distribution, and supported state and local governments facing revenue shortfalls. Biden argued aggressive federal spending was necessary to prevent economic depression and ensure rapid recovery. Critics worried about inflation and excessive government spending, concerns that proved partially justified as prices rose significantly. Biden believed the greater risk was inadequate response, that helping too much was better than helping too little. The legislation passed on purely partisan lines with no Republican support. Whether the American Rescue Plan successfully managed post-pandemic recovery or contributed to problematic inflation remains debated. But Biden prioritized aggressive intervention, choosing to risk overheating the economy rather than risking inadequate support during the unprecedented challenge of pandemic recovery and its economic aftermath. And that brings us to the present. 45 presidents, 99 facts, and somehow the nation is still here. We've covered everything from the sublime to the ridiculous. presidents who balanced budgets and presidents who couldn't balance their own cabinets, leaders who freed millions and leaders who freed nobody, reformers who dismantled the systems that made their careers possible, generals who became pacifists, pacifists who sent troops. So the next time you wonder how America made it this far, just remember, we had a president who literally paid off the entire national debt, another who was sworn in by his dad at 2 in the morning, and one who legalized homebrewing, which honestly might be his most enduring legacy. History is weird. Presidents are weirder. And somehow that's comforting. Sleep tight, knowing that leadership has always been messy, democracy has always been complicated, and the future is written by people just as flawed as everyone who came before. Good night.